Well, now it's time to see in a little bit more detail what scientists think is going on in our brain when we are engaged in the encoding and storage and consolidation of memories and then retrieving a memory. First, the basic layout of these brain pictures you see here. The outer surface of the brain is the cerebral cortex, and we've color-coded the different sensory areas here. In green would be the visual cortex, and we've got 3 neurons that are being activated by whatever this person is seeing. Here we have touch cortex in blue and auditory cortex in red. The hippocampus is shown as this structure here. We have 2 of them, one underneath each temporal lobe. And then we have this box that represents working memory. And working memory is that system that allows us to sort of manipulate information sent from other parts of the brain, but it's like a temporary workspace, so we can think about things. Whatever we're currently conscious of would be what's in the working memory system at that time. All right, let's start it off then with the encoding process. What's going on during encoding? Well, a population of cortical neurons responds to the learning episode, and cortical areas share information with the working memory system to produce a conscious experience of the event. Let's take a look at our brain. The top left here, we have activity of some neurons in the visual cortex. That represents what the person is seeing. Those neurons are going to share that information processing with the working memory system. We have touch neurons responding, auditory neurons responding, so that the person is now having a conscious experience of what they saw, what they heard, what they felt on their skin. And let's use this video that we've seen before to sort of characterize what might be happening in these different cortical regions. I'm going to play this. So here's the surface of an animal's brain, and we see some big blood vessels here. That box right here is going to be magnified in this part of the video. And when we play this video, we're going to see these little flashing lights. These are brain cells that have been genetically engineered to flash light when they become electrically excited. So these are neurons doing their computations, and it's just what's different here is that now we can see when a particular brain cell is being activated by its inputs. So this is what it would look like if our brains were engineered to flash light when our neurons are activated. This is what it would look like in all the different cortical regions during the encoding stage. Our brain is just processing the lesson. Now we're going to use this cross-section of the human brain to keep track of the cortex and the hippocampus and how they communicate. So up here we have the cerebral cortex, and you can see that the cell bodies are stained in purple. And so this thick region here, these are where the cell bodies are. And sometimes that's called gray matter. And then the white matter would be all the axons coming from those neurons in the cortex. So we can see we have a lot of territory here. So there are many neurons in the cerebral cortex. And that means that there's a lot of storage capacity for memories in the cerebral cortex. But during the encoding stage, these neurons in the cortex at different regions of the brain are just going to be processing whatever is out there in the lesson, what the lesson looks like and sounds like and feels like. But it's here where long-term memories will be stored. Down here in the hippocampus, this we can think of as the gateway to long-term memory. What will happen here is that temporary memory traces formed here will be used to strengthen the cortical memory traces up here in the cerebral cortex. So it's like we've got 2 memory systems. We've got the long-term memory system that we think of as the cerebral cortex, and then we've got this kind of short-term or daily memory system, a temporary memory system that will be used to strengthen long-term memories in the cerebral cortex. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the encoding stage. Let's just recall here what that means is that the cortical neurons are responding to the lesson, but as well, hippocampal neurons will be activated during the lesson as well. Now, why is that? We can see that on this brain here. It's because the cortical regions share information with the hippocampus. So in the last picture, we said the cortical regions were sharing information with the working memory system. Those cortical regions do both. They send information to the working memory system, but also information down into the hippocampus. So the cortical neurons also communicate with the hippocampus, and this is what allows the brain to make a long-term memory of the event. The hippocampus receives cortical information that will be linked to form a hippocampal memory trace of the event. The hippocampal memory trace represents the specific pattern of activity in the cortex, what the learning event sounded like, looked like, and felt like. So again, back up to our brain here. Here we have some visual neurons responding to the visual qualities of the lesson. Well, the pattern of activity here is going to activate a certain set of hippocampal neurons. Likewise with the touch neurons and the auditory neurons. So there's going to be a pattern of activity within the hippocampus that represents the pattern of activity in the cortex. And the hippocampal neurons are now going to be setting up a memory trace that sort of is the memory for what the event looked like, sounded like, and felt like. So that gets us to the next stage, the storage stage. After encoding, when the neurons are no longer active, the storage phase of memory formation begins. Some of the neurons activated during encoding will grow stronger synapses with each other. So back to our brain up here, the storage happens in both the cortex and the hippocampus. So a subset of neurons that were activated by the learning event are now going to grow stronger synapses with each other, both in the cortex and in the hippocampus. Let's also note here that the neurons shown in this brain are not currently activated. So we'll need to take a look at the previous picture. Notice here we have activated neurons in the cerebral cortex and in the hippocampus, and we indicate their activity by these little spiky markings. But during the storage stage, this is happening after the encoding stage. So the neurons are no longer currently responding to anything, but they're going to be growing stronger synapses with each other. And we indicate that growth by connecting those neurons, either with a dashed line here, as you see in the cortex, or a solid lines here in the hippocampus. And that will represent different strengths of these memory traces. Let's use this slide to see what was happening in the hippocampus. So if we take a look on the left here we have the hippocampus before learning, and we've got 3 neurons here, and they are receiving activity from the cortex, right, from visual cortex and auditory cortex and touch cortex. So the particular qualities of the learning event are going to activate a certain set of hippocampal neurons. Now before learning, look at the size of the synapses. They're sort of shown to be sort of small. They're weak synapses with a small terminal, axon terminal there onto the cell body of the target cell. But look at what happens after learning. Those synapses have grown stronger. And the ability of neurons to grow stronger synapses is called plasticity. So neurons are living cells, and they can grow in response to activity from the experiences in our lives. And it's this growth of the synapses that we're calling a memory trace. So the particular pattern of activity in the cortex is now going to be stored as a memory trace in the hippocampus. And the way you store a memory is you grow stronger synapses between the neurons that were activated by the learning event. And it's important to note here also that hippocampal neurons enjoy high plasticity, so they grow strong synapses with one learning event. The hippocampus now has a strong memory trace for the learning event, which is connected to the cortical memory traces. After all, it was the cortical brain cells that were sending information down their axons to the hippocampal neurons. So the hippocampal memory trace is connected to the cortical memory traces. This video up here we saw in a film in class, and what you're about to see is literally the formation of a memory trace. The red structures here would be the dendrites of the target neuron, and these green blobs here, these are axon terminals that are going to be making synapses with the red dendrites here. But what has happened with this animal is the animal has now just learned something, and we're going to see the growth of new synapses. Take a look. So this is time-lapse photography, where the axon terminals have been labeled with a green fluorescent substance, and we can see that as a result of learning, the axon terminals have increased in number and the size. So it's like we're witnessing the growth of new synapses and stronger synapses as the result of a learning episode. We're witnessing the formation of a memory trace. So that's the kind of thing that's happening in the hippocampus as well as the cortex in response to things we're trying to learn in school or in life. Now let's return to our cross section here. So down in the hippocampus, after the first learning session, we're going to have high plasticity neurons making strong synapses. So here we have 2 neurons before learning. Notice the weak synapse indicated by the sort of small axon terminal there. And then after the learning session, we get a lot of growth. So we have a strong synapse is the result of one learning episode because hippocampal neurons have high plasticity. They can grow a lot with one learning event. By contrast, look at what we're saying up here in the cortex, that with one learning event, we only get a marginal increase in synapse strength. And the way we would explain this is to say that the cortical neurons have lower plasticity. They're going to require multiple activations to really strengthen them. So we have a difference here. We have a difference in plasticity. And what this means is after one learning session, we're going to have a strong memory trace in the hippocampus, but a weak memory trace in the cortex. And again, that's because of the plasticity differences amongst the neurons in those 2 different areas. All right, so now on our brain, let's represent it this way. We've got weak cortical memory traces in the cortex, and notice we've got these dashed lines indicating that those are weak synapses between the activated neurons. By contrast, look at the solid lines between the hippocampal neurons. So we have a strong memory trace in the hippocampus. Now, the strong memory trace in the hippocampus will be the brain's way of reactivating the cortical memory traces. And the hippocampus is needed to find and reactivate the cortical memory traces because they are weak at this time. So this is a design feature of the human brain, that initially the cortical memory traces are weak, but we've made a strong hippocampal memory trace, and the brain will use this strong memory trace to retrieve, to reactivate those weak ones soon after learning. Now, why do scientists think there are these different strengths of memory traces in the cortex and the hippocampus? And that gets us back to patients like HM and Clive, who had hippocampus damage. Now, the symptoms of these gentlemen were that they could not make new long-term memories, but they could retrieve remote memories. And so this led scientists to an important conclusion that the communication between the hippocampus and the cortex builds long-term memories. If you don't have a hippocampus, you can't install new long-term memories in the cortex. You can't strengthen them, as we'll see. But you don't need a hippocampus to retrieve already well-stored memory traces in the cerebral cortex. So at this point then, after studying patients like HM and Clive, scientists now understood that remote memories are not stored in the hippocampus. They're stored in the cortex, but a functioning hippocampus is necessary to create those long-term cortical memories. And let's dig into this a little bit further. So if initially the cortical memory traces are weak, this is what would explain why HM and Clive could not make new episodic or semantic memories. The cortical memory traces immediately after encoding are just too weak to be successfully located and reactivated by cortical memory retrieval systems. Remember, HM and Clive, they don't have a hippocampus, but they do have an intact cortex, so they can do the encoding process just fine. They will make memory traces in the cortex. Unfortunately, they will remain weak. There's no way for these memory traces to be strengthened so that they could retrieve them later on. So this is why HM and Clive cannot make new long-term memory traces, at least ones that can be retrieved. They do make memory traces, but they're just too weak to be retrieved. So this led to the conclusion that the hippocampus is critically important in strengthening cortical memory traces to make them strong enough to be retrieved by other brain systems. So now let's return to a person with an intact brain and what happens during retrieval of memory right after learning. To retrieve information learned that day, the strong hippocampal memory trace is activated and communicates with the cortex to reactivate the weak cortical memory traces. Successful communication with the working memory systems produces a conscious experience of a retrieved memory. So notice our brain picture down here. So let's say somebody asks us to retrieve a memory or information that we learned earlier in the day. The idea is the hippocampal memory trace, being a strong memory trace, that will be easily reactivated, and then those hippocampal neurons are going to signal the very same cortical neurons that were involved in the learning event. So the brain is going to use the strong hippocampal memory trace to activate the weak cortical memory traces. And when they are successfully reactivated, they share their information with the working memory system, and we experience the retrieval of a memory. We're conscious of retrieving a memory. So, in a normal brain, the way we retrieve a memory soon after encoding, when we only have weak cortical memory traces, is we use the strong memory traces in the hippocampus as an index, as a guide to reactivate those weak cortical memory traces. Let's see what this looks like on our cutaway of the brain. So again, we've got weak memory traces in the cortex because we've only had one learning episode and we're trying to retrieve right after that learning episode, and scientists think that that is likely to fail because they are weak. However, we still do have this strong memory trace in the cortex. So the proposal then by scientists is that what happens is the memory search systems are capable of activating the strong hippocampal memory trace, which then can reactivate the weak cortical memory traces. So the cortical memory retrieval systems cannot directly activate the cortical weak memory traces, but the cortical systems can activate the hippocampal memory traces because they're strong, and use those strong hippocampal memory traces to reactivate the weak cortical memory traces. And notice then, if you do not have a hippocampus, you're up a creek without a paddle. Right, so you won't be able to activate a hippocampal memory trace because you don't have a hippocampus. And in addition, the cortical retrieval systems can't activate the weak cortical memory traces, so these memory traces are going to be inaccessible. And to us, it will appear that HM and Clive cannot make new long-term memories. They can't learn new stuff about the world. Right, so if you don't have a hippocampus, there's going to be no way to reactivate those weak cortical memory traces. Now, what about remote memories? So HM and Clive could retrieve remote memories. So these are memories that they had made long ago before their injury. So they had strong cortical memory traces. Well, strong cortical memory traces can be successfully reactivated by memory retrieval systems in the cortex. You do not need a hippocampus to reactivate strong cortical memory traces. So this raises an important question. How does the brain strengthen these cortical memory traces? For successful memory retrieval without a hippocampus, cortical memory traces must be strengthened somehow. And we now know how. A process called memory consolidation, which occurs during sleep, is responsible for creating strong memories in the cortex. And so now we see the benefit of the strong memory traces made in the hippocampus. They're going to be used not only to retrieve weak memory traces, but they're going to be used to strengthen weak memory traces in the cortex. During sleep, hippocampal memory traces are reactivated. Now let's look down at our brain here. So notice in the hippocampus, the neurons are being reactivated here. And just like sort of memory retrieval, the hippocampal memory traces are signaling the cortical memory traces. They're reactivating the cortical memory traces. So the brain is replaying the memory traces of the day's learning. Hippocampal neurons reactivate the cortical memory trace neurons and trigger them to grow stronger synapses. So memory consolidation makes cortical memory traces stronger and less dependent upon the hippocampus for retrieval. And again, we call this sort of hippocampal replay because the hippocampus, while we're asleep, is sort of like is reactivating the memory traces from the day's learning. It's like replaying what we learned that day so as to strengthen the cortical memory traces. And notice the cortical memory traces, they have solid lines between those cortical neurons, indicating that memory consolidation, this hippocampal replay, has strengthened the synapses amongst those neurons, making these cortical memory traces even stronger. On our cross-section then, here's the critical communication between the hippocampus and the cortex. So during memory consolidation, the hippocampal memory traces are reactivated. We're calling that hippocampal replay. They're communicating with the cortical memory traces to strengthen them. So in effect, what we're doing is integrating the day's learning into the long-term memory system. It's as if the hippocampal system represents a day's learning. The cortex is a lifetime of learning. And we're going to integrate the day's learning into the long-term memory system that represents everything we've learned. Now, really important thing happens after this memory consolidation process. After memory consolidation, in another stage of sleep, the hippocampal memory traces are weakened. The brain is refreshing the hippocampus for new learning. So take a look at our two brains here. So this is memory consolidation. We see the arrows are moving from the hippocampal memory traces up to the cortical memory traces to strengthen them. And also notice we have now solid lines between the cortical neurons representing that the memory trace got stronger. But after consolidation, look what happened. The hippocampal memory trace has disappeared. It's been erased. Now, how do you erase a hippocampal memory trace? Well, you simply weaken the hippocampal synapses amongst those neurons. So why does the brain do this? To restore plasticity to hippocampal neurons, and that will support new learning by allowing for new synapse growth. So the brain is doing two really important things during sleep. It's doing memory consolidation to strengthen cortical memory traces, but then it's refreshing the hippocampus in preparation for new learning. Here's a simplification of what we're talking about here. And the idea is that the hippocampus plasticity has limits. So here are two neurons in the hippocampus before learning and after learning. Notice the learning triggered the growth of stronger synapses here. And this is occurring while we're awake and learning things during the day. But when synapses are maximally strengthened, no new learning can occur. So we have a limitation here. If this synapse has achieved maximum strength, then these neurons cannot take part in representing any new learning. Remember, learning is rooted in the growth of stronger synapses. And if the synapses can't get any stronger, then these neurons cannot participate in learning anything new. And here's where sleep comes in. So what sleep is doing is resetting those synapses, weakening them again so that these two neurons can now be prepared. They're now capable of new learning. So you weaken the synapses so they can grow again the next day for the next day's learning. So the hippocampal synapses are now capable of new learning because they were weakened back down to a baseline level, and they can grow stronger again. Another way of thinking about why the brain is doing this is the following. We can think of the hippocampus as just a small memory capacity system. There are just far fewer neurons in the hippocampus than in the cerebral cortex. So we've got limited neurons and synapses in the hippocampus. Now this means that the synapses that get strengthened during some particular learning event during the day, well, they cannot be strengthened anymore for further learning. So as we go through the day and we learn stuff, the storage space of the hippocampus is being reduced because we have this limitation. So because there are far fewer neurons here than in the cortex, the storage space of the hippocampus quickly gets reduced as we learn things throughout the day. So how does the brain get around this? Well, that's why the brain does memory consolidation. So you use the hippocampal memory traces to strengthen the cortical ones. And there are just far more neurons and synapses up here in the cortex. So you strengthen the cortical memory traces, and that's going to then allow you to weaken or erase the hippocampal memory traces. So after you do consolidation, you're going to weaken the hippocampal memory traces to increase the storage space again. Meanwhile, you want to keep the strengthened cortical memory traces up here because that's your long-term system. And we'll say one more note, another difference between the hippocampus and the cortex. We're going to say the hippocampus has fast memory trace decay, and that's a design feature, not a bug. So the brain has evolved to have this system of hippocampal neurons that show high plasticity during learning, but then when we go to sleep, the brain weakens those synapses again to prepare for new learning. So that means the memory traces in the hippocampus have fast decay because sleep will weaken them. By contrast, the cortical neurons, there's going to be slow memory trace decay here, and that makes sense for a long-term memory system. We can represent that up here. When we make strong cortical synapses, they do not decay very much over time. And that will allow our brain to maintain strong memory traces in the long-term memory system. So with strong cortical memory traces, retrieval can be successful even if the hippocampal memory trace was significantly erased during sleep. Cortical memory retrieval systems can find and reactivate the strengthened cortical memory traces. So look at our brain down here. So sleep has erased the previous day's memory traces, but that's okay because now we've got strong cortical memory traces that can be accessed by cortical retrieval systems, and this will allow us to retrieve that information even though the hippocampal memory traces were weakened by sleep. So well-consolidated memories can be retrieved without a hippocampus. And this is what it means to be educated, that we've got strong memory traces in the cerebral cortex that can be quickly found and reactivated by cortical retrieval systems. We won't need the hippocampus to reactivate them. So this completes our tour through the brain as we engage in the encoding, storage, consolidation, and retrieval of a memory.